Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping away from the clinical side of medicine and plunging straight into the political arena. We're going to do a fast-paced, energetic refresher on the essential terminology, the theoretical frameworks, and the everyday jargon you need to understand exactly how health policy is shaped behind the scenes. Because let's be honest, if you want to know why certain health initiatives succeed while others never even get off the ground, you absolutely have to understand the language of power and process.
Okay, here's our game plan for today. We've got 5 sections. Section 1 is defining health policy, then 2, the health policy triangle. Section 3 is the lexicon of power, 4 is actors in the agenda, and we'll wrap up with Section 5, the jargon of implementation.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, defining health policy. Remember, health policy is fundamentally about politics, not just science. So, first things first, we have to actually define policy itself. Now, we usually picture policy as this formal, written document outlining a specific course of action, right? But as political scientist Thomas Dye famously pointed out, public policy is whatever governments choose to do or, and this is crucial, what they choose not to do. That is a vital piece of terminology to keep in your back pocket. Failure to act is a policy in itself. So if a government deliberately chooses not to pass a law mandating child seatbelts, well, that inaction is their policy. Now, what's really fascinating here is how health policy actually casts a much wider net than just public government policy. Yes, public policy is the realm of the state. We know that. But health policy, it includes the actions of the private sector too. For example, think about when a multinational corporation decides to provide antiretroviral therapy for its employees way before the national government even mandates it. That is a private sector decision, but it's one that profoundly impacts public health. So health policy really encompasses the entire ecosystem of institutions, services, and funding. All right, moving right along to Section 2, the health policy triangle. Because health policy is such a massive, sprawling ecosystem, we really need a mental model to make sense of it all. And for that, we turn to the health policy triangle, created by Walt and Gilson back in 1994. This triangle is basically a simplified map of a wildly complex system. It pulls us away from just staring at the content of a policy, the what. Instead, it forces us to also look at the context, the process, and, right dead center in the middle of it all, the actors. You literally cannot separate the technical content of a policy from the people making it, the environment they're operating in, and the specific steps they take to actually get it done. Just as a quick refresher, the context corner of that triangle refers to all the systemic factors surrounding a policy. Think of it as the terrain where the policy battle is fought. This could be situational, like, say, a sudden earthquake that instantly changes hospital building regulations. Or it could be structural, like a country's economic wealth and political setup. It can even be cultural, like deeply held religious beliefs that dictate which public health interventions the public will actually accept. Next up is Section 3, the lexicon of power. Let's talk about influence. You simply cannot analyze health policy without understanding who has power and how they wield it. Because technical expertise alone doesn't change policy, power does. So I want to pose this fundamental question to you. What exactly is power? In policy analysis, we usually define it in a relational sense. It's having power over someone else. Basically, it's the ability of actor A to get actor B to do something they wouldn't normally do. But how does that actually happen in the real world? Well, Stephen Lukes broke this down into 3 dimensions of power, and it is absolutely brilliant. The first dimension is super obvious: power as decision-making. You win the debate, you pass the law, boom, done. But the second dimension, that's power as non-decision-making. This is agenda setting. It's the power to keep threatening issues entirely out of sight. Like when the tobacco industry secretly funded experts to keep global health organizations focused on infectious diseases instead of the harms of smoking. Sneaky, right? And the third dimension is thought control, literally shaping the very desires and values of the public so they don't even realize they have a conflicting interest in the first place. Let's brush up on a little more jargon with Max Weber's 3 types of authority. Because having the formal right to influence people is just as crucial as having the brute power to do it. Weber identified traditional authority. Think of the ingrained trust to community places in a local elder or a midwife. Then there's charismatic authority, which is driven by an intense personal commitment to a specific leader, kind of like a Nelson Mandela figure. Finally, you've got rational legal authority, where power is baked into formal rules and the office itself, regardless of who's sitting in the chair, like a Ministry of Health secretary. Oh, and in health policy, we usually add a fourth: technical authority. That's the power doctors hold simply because they have specialized medical knowledge. That perfectly sets up Section 4, actors in the agenda.
Now that we've got a handle on power and authority, the big question is, how does society actually distribute all this power among different actors? Well, there's a grand theoretical debate here. Pluralists view society as this open marketplace where power is widely distributed. In a pluralist system, policy is just the end result of all these different interest groups bargaining and competing with each other. Elitists, on the other hand, argue no way. They say power is highly concentrated in the hands of a privileged minority, a power elite of wealthy individuals, corporate leaders, or maybe the military, who just call the shots regardless of what the general public actually wants. Looking at this image of a rigid, towering glass building, it's actually the perfect metaphor for our next vocabulary word: institutions. In policy analysis, institutions aren't just physical buildings. They're the formal structures and the informal rules of the game that heavily constrain the choices available to our policy actors. A country's constitution, its electoral system, the unwritten rules of how lobbyists interact with politicians, those are all institutions, and they create what we call path dependency, meaning the decisions made way back in the past severely limit the room to maneuver in the future. Now, when actors try to navigate these rigid institutions, they almost never go it alone. You probably remember this term, epistemic community. This refers to a network of professionals and technical experts who share a common understanding of a scientific problem and what causes it. Think about the global networks of infectious disease researchers. They collaborate and present a unified, evidence-based front to influence global health policy. Then we have a related, but definitely distinct term, the advocacy coalition. While an epistemic community is usually tied together by science, an advocacy coalition casts a much wider net. It brings together politicians, civil servants, journalists, and activists. What unites them isn't a scientific background, but shared political ideas and goals. They pool their resources together and basically battle it out with competing coalitions to get their specific solutions recognized by the state.
All right, let's transition to our fifth and final section, the jargon of implementation. What happens after a policy is actually formulated?
The implementation gap. This term really captures the sad, messy reality of health policy. Because creating a grand policy at the highest levels of government absolutely does not mean it's going to happen on the ground. The implementation gap is that frustrating space where huge health initiatives just fall apart, whether it's due to a lack of resources, terrible communication, or just active resistance from the people involved. It is the stark difference between what the policy architect intended and the actual end result. Analysts usually look at this gap through two very different lenses. Top-down implementation treats the whole process as purely administrative. It assumes that if the central government just writes clear enough rules, sets up a strict chain of command, and hands out the money, the policy is going to succeed. Bottom-up implementation completely flips that on its head. It argues that you simply cannot control the process from a desk in the capital city. It recognizes the massive amount of discretion that frontline workers, local doctors, nurses, regional managers actually have, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who decide how or even if a policy is delivered based on their own local culture and context. Which brings us to one of my absolute favorite concepts in this whole lexicon, bounded rationality. Look, in a perfect world, policymakers would sit down, look at every single piece of data, and choose the optimal solution. But in reality, they suffer from bounded rationality. They're under intense time pressure, their information is flawed, and they are constantly navigating competing political interests. So instead of finding that one perfect solution, they do what we call satisficing. They just muddle through and pick a solution that is satisfactory, safe, and, well, good enough for the moment. So there you have it. We've covered the triangle, the dimensions of power, the coalitions, and the implementation gaps. You are officially refreshed on the lexicon of health policy. But remember, learning the jargon is really only the first step. The real test is applying it. I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Take a look around your own local health system. Look at the policies being debated right now. Who are the actors? Which coalitions are fighting it out? And fundamentally, behind all the technical reports and shiny press releases, who truly holds the power? Keep these terms in mind, and I promise you, you'll start seeing your health system in an entirely new light. Consider a perfectly engineered pharmaceutical. High clinical efficacy, low production cost, flawless laboratory trials. Yet when deployed in a specific national health system, the drug fails to reach patients. Supplies rot in warehouses, and mortality rates barely shift. Medical data and economic modeling, what analysts call the content of a policy, cannot force a health system to adapt. A clinical guideline does not implement itself, and cost-benefit analyses do not command budgets. To understand why robust health initiatives survive or die in the real world, we rely on the Walt and Gilson health policy triangle. It maps the 4 interdependent dimensions that actually determine public health outcomes. Content is the technical substance. It is the specific intervention on paper, a new tuberculosis protocol, a user fee structure, or a vaccination mandate. Context is the systemic environment absorbing that intervention. This includes macroeconomic conditions, historical funding deficits, demographic shifts, or the political instability of a region. Process details the mechanics of execution. It is the sequence of how an issue is first identified, the way it is negotiated through committee, and the exact steps taken to mandate it on the ground. Actors are the humans and organizations involved. These are the NGOs, corporate entities, local clinicians, and state officials who actively push the policy forward or use their leverage to block it. Diagnosing a disease requires biology. Diagnosing a public health failure requires analyzing all 4 of these dimensions simultaneously. An elegant medical solution deployed without a political strategy guarantees failure. Focus closely on the individuals and organizations driving these decisions. Policymaking is an arena of competing interests and power struggles, rather than a cooperative search for the absolute best medical outcome. Sociologist Stephen Lukes mapped 3 dimensions of power. The first is observable decision-making, where 2 actors directly clash over a visible issue. The second is non-decision-making, the power to control the agenda itself, preventing the debate from ever happening. If a corporation knows a proposed sugar tax will hurt margins, lobbying to defeat the bill is risky. Using institutional leverage to ensure the bill is never drafted in the first place is a far more secure exercise of power. The third dimension is ideological thought control. It's the ability to shape societal norms so deeply that disadvantaged groups internalize dominant values and retreat from conflicts. If citizens are convinced that poor health is entirely a failure of individual responsibility, they will not demand systemic protections. The conflict remains latent. How these dimensions play out depends on state structure. In a pluralist system, diverse interest groups compete openly, forcing compromises. In an elitist system, a high-status minority dictates the parameters of public health from the top down. Public choice theory argues that state bureaucrats act in pure self-interest. They capture health policies to protect departmental budgets and expand their own influence. Influence rarely comes down to winning a high-profile floor vote. It is the invisible capacity to determine what options are placed on the ballot. Basic administration textbooks teach the stages heuristic, a clean, linear sequence from problem identification to implementation. That structure is a fiction. Real-world formulation is a messy, reactive cycle. Decision-makers operate via incrementalism, constantly muddling through competing pressures. To map how an issue reaches the legislative agenda, John Kingdon developed the multiple streams framework. It tracks 3 independent currents.
First is the problem stream, sudden crises or shifting disease indicators. Second is the policy stream, the hidden domain of researchers keeping technical solutions on standby. Third is the politics stream, the unpredictable current of national mood swings and volatile elections. A policy window is the rare moment when all 3 streams converge. A crisis highlights a problem, researchers have a solution, and the political climate is highly receptive to action. When that window opens, visible entrepreneurs strike. High-profile politicians or UN goodwill ambassadors, like Carla Bruni, use their massive public reach to push the agenda through. But those visible figures rely entirely on the hidden participants, the analysts who generated and vetted the technical alternative years before the public ever paid attention. This dynamic creates what political scientists term punctuated equilibrium. Decades of rigid policy stasis are abruptly interrupted by an exogenous shock, a pandemic or a market collapse, forcing rapid, massive legislative action. Formulating health policy requires an acceptance of this chaos. It means building rigorous technical solutions and keeping them ready until an opening appears. When a policy passes, it hits the execution phase. Here, we find the implementation gap, the severe divergence between legislative intent and reality on the ground. The top-down perspective assumes strict hierarchical control. A principal sets a target, and regional clinics comply. But relying solely on rigid policy instruments results in routine failure.
central authorities lack bandwidth to monitor every ground-level interaction. The bottom-up perspective acknowledges the immense power of street-level bureaucrats. Local clinic managers, frontline nurses, and supply chain operators actively filter, alter, and reject commands from the top. Facility culture, local context, and severe resource constraints act as the unwritten software of a health system. If a national mandate demands a protocol that a local clinic cannot physically staff, frontline workers will quietly rewrite the rules to survive. To bridge this disconnect, analyst Paul Sabatier developed the Advocacy Coalition framework. He observed that implementation is driven by subsystems of diverse actors, journalists, local doctors, and regional politicians, forming coalitions based on shared beliefs. Ground-level execution is never a passive administrative task. It is an active, ongoing political battleground at the street level. The Walt and Gilson health policy triangle is not a static flowchart. It maps a hostile, deeply political ecosystem. To navigate it prospectively, practitioners use stakeholder analysis. This plots the landscape on a simple matrix. The vertical axis measures power. You place actors on the vertical axis based on their tangible political resources. This factors in their institutional legitimacy, network access, and raw capital. Then you map them along the horizontal axis to reflect their exact position on your proposed policy. You locate their specific degree of support or hostility. Certain actors warp this grid entirely. Specialized expert networks, known as epistemic communities, and transnational corporate entities command immense resources, skewing the map and dictating the boundaries of what is possible. By visualizing this, you execute proactive strategy. If a high-power actor is entrenched in deep opposition, you recalibrate the technical content of your policy just enough to slide them horizontally into neutrality. Epidemiology and economics provide the data to diagnose the disease, but mastering the brutal mechanics of the policy process is the only way to actually deliver the cure.